On March 28th, 1896, the famous counterfeiter Emanuel Ninger was arrested. And they found on his person $244.25. And it consisted of both good money and bad money, real money and not real money, counterfeit money. And Ninger's story, they say, took on kind of mythic proportions. It's reported that when he was arrested, they went to his house and they found 3 oil paintings, and it's reported that they sold for $5,000 each or more. It's reported that it took him more time to do one counterfeit bill, or about the same time as it did to paint one painting. And the point was that if he would have made his living legitimately doing paintings, he could have made more money than he did doing forgeries. He was so good at his forgeries that shopkeepers, when they would receive his bills, would sometimes take them and put them on the wall and frame them because they were just so amazing, so intricate. He would do them all by pencil and by pen. And we have a slide of one of his counterfeit bills that he did up on the screen here. Just intricate, amazing work. His years of lawlessness came to an end when he went to the Cortlandt Street Saloon and he ordered a glass of wine. He took the $50 bill and set it on the counter. The counter happened to be wet, and the ink drained through, and the bartender picked it up, and it was just all falling off. He soon called a police officer. The police officer came and picked him up, and he was convicted. And after that, he served his time, and he kind of passed into anonymity. But if he would have used his gift properly, he probably could have been a very famous artist because of if you just see the work that he did, just with a pencil and pen to create something like that, it was just amazing. But he misused his gift. Have you ever tried to use something that was outside of its intended purpose? I remember a couple of years ago, my brother went to a flea market and he picked up this bat to use in softball. You know, it was a decent-sized bat, and he took it back home, and they said it was a softball bat. He took it back home, and we were kind of doing some batting practice, and we're taking swings and hitting the balls. And then we look at the bat, and we see these huge dents in the bat. And it turned out that the bat wasn't actually an adult softball bat. It was like a children's baseball bat. But it was like the same length as an adult softball bat, so we didn't know it. But it was ruined because it was used outside of its intended purpose. Today we're going to look at a parable of Jesus, a parable about misuse, specifically about the misuse of money. It's one of the most puzzling parables of Jesus. It's found in Luke chapter 16. If you turn there, we'll read that. And this parable it's very vexing. In fact, scholar Darrell Bock lists no less than 6 interpretive options for understanding this parable. But I think fundamentally this is a parable about misuse, about the misuse of money. So if you turn to Luke chapter 16, and when you find that, if you wouldn't mind standing, out of reverence for the reading of Scripture, and we'll read from verses 1 to 13. If you don't have a Bible, there's one in front of you, and you can take that home if you don't have one at home. Luke chapter 16, starting at verse 1. He also said to the disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought against him that this man was wasting his possessions. And he called him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager.' And the manager said to himself, 'What shall I do since my master has taken the management away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses.' So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He said, 100 measures of oil. He said to him, 'Take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, 'How much do you owe?' He said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, 'Take your bill and write 80. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, Make friends for yourself by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. One who is faithful in very little is also faithful in much. One who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust you to the true riches? And if you have not been faithful in that which is in others, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. You can be seated. Dear Lord, I just thank you for this day. God, I just pray that you just speak through me as I talk about this parable. It's very difficult for us to wrap our minds around, to interpret. God, I just pray that the things that you want to impress on our hearts would be impressed on our hearts. I pray that you challenge us in areas of our lives that we need to be challenged, and comfort us in areas of our lives that we need to be comforted. And God, I just pray that we would just see the great value of who you are, and we would be changed because of what you've done for us. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. So, very interesting parable, very difficult to understand. It has some very interesting things here. Making friends by means of unrighteous wealth. It talks about eternal dwellings. Hard to kind of wrap our minds around. But we have in the story a story of a rich man who has a manager. This was a common practice in the ancient world. In that day and age, we've talked about in previous messages, a person who was a wealthy landowner would have a manager who would govern his affairs, specifically when he would go away on business trips. And so it says in the text that he was squandering the master's possessions. Now this could refer on one hand to simply mismanaging the master's assets, but it also could refer to simply wasting the master's possessions, using them for his own purposes. And I'm inclined to think that that's what he was talking about. It's the same word that's used in the story of the prodigal son, where it says the prodigal son squandered his father's possessions on riotous living. So he probably used his master's possessions for his own purposes. And so the master comes to him and says that he can no longer be manager anymore. And we notice in this text the guilt of the manager. He doesn't offer any excuses for his behavior. He doesn't say, check the books and see that I'm innocent. He doesn't offer any explanation. He just acknowledges that, yeah, he did it. He squandered his master's possessions. But he's in a dilemma. Being a manager was kind of a white-collar occupation. And he says, I'm not strong enough to dig. He knows he's going to lose his job. And he says, I'm not strong enough to dig. Digging was one of the hardest forms of physical labor in that day. He says, I'm ashamed to beg. So he's in a dilemma. He's like, what am I going to do? It's almost like if someone was a corporate executive making $75,000 a year, and he loses his job, and he's considering the prospect of going and working at McDonald's. That's what this guy is kind of wrestling with. And so he gets this bright idea that he's going to go to his master's debtors and try to get them in his favor. Now, the master's debtors were also men of great means. They weren't poor men. It says in the text that the one man owed the master 100 measures of oil. This would be equivalent to 875 gallons, or the amount produced from 150 olive trees. So this person owed a lot, and he was definitely a man of means. The second man owed 100 measures of wheat, which would be the yield of about 100 acres of grain. So both of these men were men of great means, people who in the future one day might even need a manager, people who were capable of taking care of this manager if he fell into, after he lost his job. But what's interesting in the text is this manager goes to these debtors and reduces their debt. But it's interesting that the master praises him for his action, because it's really a dishonest action, and that's what scholars and interpreters have really struggled over, that the master praises him for something that seems like it's dishonest. Well, there's a number of different possibilities of why the master praises this manager for his action. And perhaps it was because partially he didn't have much choice. This manager had gone to the debtors and reduced their debt, showed generosity to them. So how could the master go and get angry at this manager who had shown generosity? It would surely incite the rage of these debtors. In addition, he was already being removed, so how much more could he do? Further, the record of debt had been destroyed. The manager said, "Here, take this, and we'll destroy this record of debt." So the record of debt was destroyed. So I think while the master didn't really admire his dishonesty, he admired his cleverness, his shrewdness. The fact that he took what he had and he made the most of it. It might almost be like, and we've looked at some of these before, like a teacher admiring the creativity of students' answers, even when the answers are wrong. And I pulled up a few of these, a few more of these that are kind of funny for us to look at today. It says to expand the equation, and they just brought it out and expanded it. And this one, I think it's hard to read. It says, if I had an hour to live, I'd spend it in this class because it feels like an eternity. This one says, Miranda can't see anything when she looks down at her microscope. Suggest one reason why not. Because she's blind. That's a possibility. And I think this master, while he doesn't necessarily admire the manager's dishonesty, he admires the manager's cleverness, his shrewdness. He's doing something wrong, but if nothing else, it's clever. It's, in a sense, wise. And then we get to the point of the parable. It says, "For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourself by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings." So the first part of that passage I just read tells us that the sons of this world know how to get what they want. They use the world system to achieve their own ends. And as demonstrated in this passage and by the action of the manager, often their ends are selfish, their own desires, their own wants. But they know how to work the system, so to speak. And we see in this passage that this manager, he loves money and he knows how to acquire money. He has little desire to please the master. Otherwise, if he desired to please the master, he wouldn't be losing his job. He wouldn't be squandering the master's possession. So he's not concerned about pleasing the master. And we don't see, he's not really concerned about the debtors either. He doesn't go to the debtors to reduce their debt out of generosity. He simply goes there for his own purposes. He even maybe plays one off against another. He keeps his options open. And he's concerned about little else than his own money, his own security, and his own happiness. But he's shrewd, he's creative, he's clever. He knows how to work the system, so to speak. For those of us who are believers in Jesus, our goal is different. Our goal is to love the master and to love people, which is in a sense the opposite of what this manager does. See, in this parable, the manager loves his money, and he uses people and he uses the master to achieve his own goals of acquiring money and comfort. But this passage teaches us that followers of Jesus should use money to love God and serve people. Followers of Jesus should use money to love God and serve people. In other words, we're to use our money creatively, shrewdly, cleverly, for the purpose of loving God and loving people more effectively. Luke 16, verse 9 says, "And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings." I know that's a verse that's really hard for me to wrap my mind around. It has a lot of interesting things in it. But it says, make friends by means of unrighteous wealth. What is it talking about when it talks about unrighteous wealth? Well, of course, money isn't in itself wrong. It's not wrong to use money. We need money to function in society. But I think there's two options for why it's referred to as unrighteous wealth. And the first option is that it's because it's a part of the world's system. In other words, we need money, but it's a part of today's society, part of this age. In the age to come, when we get to heaven, we won't need money anymore. So it's unrighteous in that sense. The second option is that it's unrighteous in the sense that it often causes us to be selfish or self-absorbed. But as believers in Jesus, we should use our money as a means to serve people and to love God. And not use people as a means to serve ourselves and to get money. And when the world sees us, they should see a difference in how we use our resources. It doesn't mean that we don't use money. It doesn't mean that we don't save money. It doesn't mean that we don't buy things that are nice. But for the follower of Jesus, money is simply a tool, not an end in itself. It's something that we use to love God and love people. And when we use money as a tool rather than an end in itself, the world will take notice. And we might be able to serve people at their greatest point of need. Because the truth is, when we have money, it tends to communicate to our hearts an illusion of security or invincibility. But when the storms of life come and the foundations of our life start to crack, we start to realize that money isn't as important as we thought it was. When we face an inoperable cancer, what's in our bank account doesn't matter so much anymore. When we're facing the pain of a miscarriage, money isn't so important anymore. When we're facing depression, money isn't so important anymore. Money will not ultimately satisfy us. And it says in this text that make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, and it will fail, it will never satisfy. One writer named Lauren Leister tells a story of Sam Polk. It says, Lauren writes, by 30 years old, Sam Polk had made more than $5 million in bonuses alone during 8 years working on Wall Street. As a trader, he was living it up in Manhattan by the age of 25. Polk said it was an easy thing to go to a World Series game, which for a lot of people was like a dream. I had a tremendous feeling of importance and power, especially as a 25-year-old kid. But at the age of 30, he abruptly quit his job on Wall Street. Despite the money Polk had been making, he was still consumed by envy. He went on to work at a hedge fund, and his obsession with money only got worse. In the New York Times op-ed article he wrote, now working elbow to elbow with billionaires, I was a giant fireball of greed. I'd think about how my colleagues could buy Micronesia if they wanted to, or become the mayor of New York City. They didn't just have money, they had power. Senators came to their offices. They were royalty. Polk describes getting angry over a $3.6 million bonus because it wasn't big enough. He realized that he had what he now calls a wealth addiction. He explained, I came to realize I had been using money as this thing that would quell all my fears. So I had this belief that maybe someday I would get enough money that I would no longer be scared. I would feel successful. And one of the things I learned on Wall Street was no matter how much money I made, the money never was going to do it. When it fails, they will welcome you into the eternal dwellings. We can, by the way we use our money and resources, be a conduit for someone else's spiritual growth. When we show people that Jesus is more valuable to us than our possessions, than our money, that people are more valuable to us than our stuff, it's a powerful testament to the world and to those who are unbelieving. And when the bottom falls out in other people's lives, when they've built their security on possessions, when that all falls out, and we have communicated love to them through Christ, they will come to us, and we will be able to communicate the love of Christ to them. And when we go to the Father and go to heaven, and it'll be almost like they'll welcome us into the eternal dwellings. We might come to someone who we've shown love to, and they might say to us, yes, that's the person that showed me that Jesus is more valuable than money. That's the person that showed to me that there's more to life than possessions. And guess what? I didn't believe it for a while. I was flying high in life, making tons of money, but when the bottom fell out and I needed something more than money, you showed me that Jesus is all satisfying, that he can satisfy more than anything else can. Eugene Maddox tells a story about Lee Strobel. Lee Strobel, as you know, or as many of you may know, was a famous journalist, and he's now a believer and apologist. He's wrote the Case for Christ, the Case for Faith, and a number of other works. But he started off his life as a devout atheist. And as a journalist working for the Chicago Tribune, he was assigned to go to an inner city impoverished family around Christmas time. And so he went there, and he describes the circumstances of these people that he went to. He says, the Delgados, 60-year-old Perfecta and her granddaughters, Lydia and Jenny, had been burned out of their roach-infested tenement and were now living in a tiny 2-room apartment on the west side. As I walked in, I couldn't believe how empty it was. There was no furniture, no rugs, nothing on the walls, only a small kitchen table and one handful of rice. That's it. They were virtually devoid of possessions. In fact, 11-year-old Lydia and 13-year-old Jenny owned only one short-sleeved dress each, plus one thin gray sweater between them. When they walked the half-mile to school through the biting cold, Lydia would wear the sweater for part of the distance and then hand it to her shivering sister, who would wear it the rest of the way. But despite their poverty and the painful arthritis that kept Perfecta from working, she still talked confidently about her faith in Jesus. She was convinced he had not abandoned them. I never sensed despair or self-pity in her home. Instead, there was a gentle feeling of hope and peace. Strobel completed his article, then moved on to more high-profile assignments. But he found his thoughts going back to these Delgados. And he was amazed by the irony of this situation as he writes. He says, here was a family that had nothing but faith and yet seemed happy, while I had everything I needed materially but lacked faith. And inside I felt as empty and as barren as their apartment. Later, sometime later, he decided to pay a visit again to the Delgados. And when he arrived, he was amazed at what he saw. Readers of his article had responded to great generosity, filling the small apartment with many donations. There was new furniture, appliances, rugs, a Christmas tree, lots of presents, bags of food, and a large selection of warm winter clothing. And they even donated a generous amount of cash. But what shocked Strobel as being an atheist was not all the stuff that was there, but was the Delgados' response to it. He writes, as surprised as I was by this outpouring, I was even more astonished by what my visit was interrupting. Perfecta and her granddaughters were getting ready to give away much of their newfound wealth. When I asked Perfecta why, she replied in halting English, our neighbors are still in need. We cannot have plenty while they have nothing. This is what Jesus would want us to do. That blew me away. If I had been in their position at that time in my life, I would have been hoarding everything. I asked Perfecta when she thought about the generosity of the people who had sent all of these goodies, and again what she thought, and again her response amazed me. This is wonderful. This is very good, she said, gesturing toward all the gifts. We did nothing to deserve this. It's a gift from God, but, she added, it's not the greatest gift. No, we celebrate that tomorrow. That is Jesus. To her, this child in the manger was the undeserved gift that meant everything. More than material possessions, more than comfort, more than security. And that moment, something inside of me wanted desperately to know this Jesus. Because in a sense, I saw him in Perfecta and her granddaughters. They had peace despite poverty, while I had anxiety despite plenty. They knew the joy of generosity, while I only knew the loneliness of ambition. They looked heavenward for hope, while I only looked out for myself. They experienced the wonder of the spiritual, while I was shackled to the shallowness of the material. And something made me long for what they had, or more accurately, for the one that they knew. We can, by the way we use our possessions and our resources, be a powerful testament to the world that Jesus is greater than we can ever imagine. But as it says in verse 13, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. So the question I have for us today is, who is your master today? Are you using God and using people to achieve your own ends, whether that's money or whether that's something else? Or are you loving God and people and using money and the resources that you have for that purpose? What are some ways that we can do that tangibly? What are some ways that we can use our resources to serve and bless those in need? There's a few different ways, and there's certainly not a comprehensive list, but there's a few different ways I noted here. Number one, we can meet tangible needs as they arise among those that are close to us. Someone that we know, a friend or relative who's in great need, and we can show them the love of Christ tangibly by giving them something, by giving them food if they're in need of food. Just trying to meet tangible needs in those around us and showing them the love of Christ. We can do that by giving generously to the local church. We can do that by sponsoring a child. There's thousands of children in third world countries who are in need of support and in need of hope. And there's a number of organizations that work in reaching those children. One of them is Compassion International, where you can go online and support a child. I think it's $38 a month, and they help provide the basic care for them. And it's a Christian organization, so they provide the gospel to them also. And we can also serve those in need by finding a need in the community and working creatively to raise awareness to meet that need. When I was in, a couple of years ago, me and my brother went to the Passion Conference in Atlanta, Georgia. And at that time, there wasn't a lot of talk about the slavery that occurs in the world. And at that conference, there was this huge push to gain awareness about the 27 million slaves that exist around the world today. And at that conference, college students raised, I think, over $3 million in that 3-day conference, or 3 or 4-day conference, for the cause of freeing slaves that are around the world today. There's needs in our community. There's needs like that around the world. There's needs in our community. And we can work creatively and use our resources and our time creatively to help meet those needs and raise awareness for those needs. And finally, we can do that by a very tangible, very easy thing, by purchasing diapers for the local YWCA. The Gross family has arranged to have a diaper drive here at the church. So for the next couple of weeks, we can bring diapers to help those single mothers, unwed mothers, through the YWCA and help provide tangibly for them and show the love of Christ to them. So followers of Jesus as followers of Jesus, we should use our money to love God and to serve people. Let's pray. Dear Lord, I just pray that you just be with us. God, I just pray that you just impress on our hearts the way that you would have us to serve other people and to love you more fully. God, I just pray that we would just use all the things that we have and leverage them for your kingdom and your glory. So that though we have possessions, though we have lots of things, that people would say about our lives that the most important thing in our lives is you. The second most important thing is people. God, I just pray that our hearts would be rallied around that priority. And I just pray that you just give us wisdom, give us strength to do and to steward everything that you've given us most effectively. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.